Welcome to a discussion on dynamics of identity. And identity is what we are. However, this we as a representation of the society, of any collectivity, maybe the nationhood, maybe the group, maybe the communities, get negotiated with so many other social processes of the society. In the process of such negotiation and engagement, while some of the core areas of this identity remain structured, settled and anchored, many of the areas get redefined, rejuvenated and reconstructed. In the contemporary society, especially in the age of globalization, fast economic transformation and also enormous flow of communication and human being across the globe, the whole identity is getting redefined in a contradictory process. While on the one hand there has been a process of rejuvenation of primordial identities, maybe in the name of caste, race and other, there has also been a resurgence of so many secular identities, maybe fluidity of identities. To discuss several dynamics of this identity, today we are having among us Professor Dipankar Gupta from Jawaharlal Nehru University. Professor Dipankar Gupta is a phenomenon in sociology himself. He has specialized himself in the areas of study in social stratification, modernization, globalization, identity politics and social movement in general. I, on behalf of the sociology faculty and on my personal behalf, welcome you Professor Gupta in this studio. And as we have been now visualizing a different process of resurgence of identities, will you please explain very briefly how a sociologist, different from those of social psychologists, will conceptualize identity?
Well, thank you very much for asking me here. This is an important topic because all too often we tend to believe that identities are fixed and immobile, and a point that you made very nicely in your introduction. But identities actually keep changing and altering depending on the circumstance. The other popular way of looking at identity is to understand identity by the book. So whatever is written in some sacerdotal text becomes the foundation for identities. In that sense, what happens is that cultures and religions are almost as if pre-programmed from the start to be at loggerheads. But that is not really the case. So instead of the text, I think what we should look at is the context. So it is not the canonical aspect, but what do people actually do? If you look at the entirety of a person's culture or religious background, you will find that there are so many areas which are in common, regardless of religion. Any religion you take, I think 98% is in common. Maybe 1 or 2% here and there which are different. But what actually separates different communities is not the thought system so much. What separates them is what they actually do in praxis. In other words, orthopraxis takes over from orthodoxy. You'll always find that whenever there is some kind of heightened tension, it is because we distinguish ourselves from others in terms of what we do, and very rarely on the basis of what we think, because on that level there is so much overlap. You might remember Malinowski said that we should have 3 levels of analysis. One is what people do, what they say they do, and what they think. They're not the same at all. So the canonical aspect, the textual aspect has to be kept in the background, and what we should look at is the context. There have been studies in the past which have looked at identities in terms of structured, well cemented boundaries, and that is, I think, useful if you want to detail a particular culture's nuances of a particular culture in great detail. In fine pen you want to illustrate what is tradition, what is belief, what is the etymology of certain terms. But when you come down to the real world, you will find most people who are very religious or culturally quite devout are not so well versed in the textual tradition. So in our contemporary world, when we find communities clashing against each other, it is not in the entirety of their cultural background that is making or compelling them to come to loggerheads. There are certain very sharp and angular aspects of their everyday life which is being heightened, blown up, so that it can be used for political purposes. For example, Hindus and Muslims for a long time beef eating and cow worshipping. That became, a central feature. So if you want to actually incite some rebellion, so some dissatisfaction amongst Hindus, all you got to do is to, have a carcass of a cow or a head of a cow in some temple. Vice versa, you can throw a pig, or you can play music. See, they have nothing to do with thought. This is all to do with certain elements of practice. With Hindus and Sikhs, again, the same problem had happened in a different way. So I would say that we must be able to differentiate sociologically that it is not the entirety that is being, made salient in such identity clashes. There are very, angular and very minor aspects of everyday practice which are heightened, as if they matter, as if they are the only things that matter. Even beef eating is not used against Christians, but it's used against Muslims. You see, the British were here, they used to eat beef all the time, and nobody seemed to complain at that point. But you see, this is what it is. So I think the context should always be kept in mind. Only then will we realize how politicians are using quote unquote culture for their ends. Otherwise, it gives a feeling that people are motivated from inside. They can't control their anger. It is spilling over on the streets because their culture is so programmed. Beef eaters must attack cow worshippers and vice versa. But actually that's not the case. Very often they don't attack each other. And when they do, it is always with a political motive and a politics that picks on very angular aspects which are contradictorily positioned in order to make political capital.
Just to mention two important things. One is that contextualizing the identity, one. Another is that one thought process, another is the action. Now, while we are identifying identity, should we privilege action over the thought in defining the context? What will be your idea in this?
I think when we are looking at identity in a political context, and today, what really matters is how different communities are politically, against each other or contradictorily positioned. That seems to matter the most. Otherwise, you can study a culture any old way, but I may be a Hindu or I may be a Muslim, but I may know very little about Hinduism or Islam. For instance, Shiv Sena chief Bal Thackeray told me that it is not necessary to understand the Vedas or to know Sanskrit as long as you can hate Muslims, and take revenge against them for all the injustices they've done. So he told me in a very nice graphic sentence. It says, you can be a true Hindu and wear blue jeans. You see, so that I think makes the point. So I don't think it's a culture in that sense, but what people actually do, or what people actually do is based on how you're able to whip up certain passions at a certain point in time. What works in 2003 may not work in 2007. So the context is very important. You can't get Muslims and Hindus against each other, at least Hindus against Muslims in Gujarat today, as you could in 2002, as you could in 1993 Bombay. So the politics of it, the context, the setting, the stage, all that is important. But when people do what they do, basically in attacking the other, it is not built on as I was telling you, on a whole range of thought processes, but built on very, very, very small aspect of practice, which is then magnified and amplified beyond justification.
Now, especially coming to this situation of resurgence of religious fundamentalism and kind of ethnic politics, now that we are having a vast number of the people living below the poverty line, we have also enormous flow of the capital and fast flow of the economic growth. Within this whole process, we are find on the one hand resurgence of this communal identity, and politicians, as you rightly pointed out, that politicians are using some parts of this identity, using some kind of angularities. Now, do you believe that the economic scenario of the country is having some kind of a role to rearticulate those kind of identities?
Yes, I think we have to be a little careful here, because you mentioned communalism, fundamentalism, ethnicity. And I think that three very different things. For example, in ethnicity, the real point that is being made by activists from the majority side is that the other community is not truly Indian. They are fifth columnists waiting to undermine the sovereignty and integrity of the country. In fundamentalism, it is the book that tells you what to do, and in communalism of certain kinds, like identity and language, or identity and boundaries, state boundaries, it is economics that matters the most.
Yeah.
So I would say economics matters in caste wars, economics matters in linguistic wars,
Yeah.
you know, but economics does not matter in ethnic wars, because when there's a fight between Muslims and Hindus, it is not as if Hindus want Muslim jobs, because Muslims, you know, usually, as we know, Sachar Committee and the National Sample Survey has they brought it out very clearly that the Muslims are, you know, amongst the lowest in the popular in terms of economic standing, amongst the lowest. So you don't want a Muslim's job. Even when the Sikhs were attacked in 1984, it was not for the jobs the Sikhs held. It is a demonstration of national anxiety which was whipped up. So economics plays a role perhaps in such ethnic movements where you see an insider as an outsider to the nation state. And economics may come in later on. You may have real estate speculators, builders, thugs, mafia men who will take advantage of it. But when people come on the streets to attack, you know, an ethnic outsider, quote unquote, who's an insider actually, it is not for economic reasons. I think economics plays a very important role in linguistic tensions, you see, and in caste tensions. They play a very important role. In fundamentalism, in India we don't really have fundamentalism. Because, as I told you earlier, it is not as if we are protecting Hindus as a Hindu way of life. What we are going to do is we are identifying enemies of Hinduism, attacking them.
Okay.
You know, Ayatollah Khomeini said very clearly that there is this shaitan called America, but we Islamic people, he told his, you know, followers, should not depend only on this shaitan. We should look into ourselves. There is a lot in the 5 pillars of Islam that we should, you know, we should try and develop and, you know, have them deeply ingrained within us. So look at your own religion, look at your book, and try to be more and more faithful to your text and tradition. In ethnicity, that is not so important. Ethnicity, the person has to be identified as an outsider to the nation state, as if that person or the group of people are undermining the nation state, and that creates a certain kind of hysteria which is based on, well, blood, soil, history, tradition, you know, and it is not so much economics in such instance. But economics can enter to take advantage of it later on, but they are not the moving forces. The other question is asked about globalization is simply this. I think one of the things that globalization did is to undermine certain kinds of ideologies which, for right or wrong reasons, prevailed over a long period of time. Ideology of secularism, or you might even say left-wing activism, or whatever. With globalization, one important aspect that came to the fore was that individuals matter. Individuals in the marketplace, you know, that is an important thing. To a certain extent, the market may sort things out, maybe not, but that was the way in which globalization looked at the entire social process.
Are you going to say that globalization is creating more of a secular varieties of identities?
No, I don't know about that, because I think identities, secular identities are based on class or economic occupations and groups. These identities are always there. They've always been there, but they don't clash, you see. You won't have computer workers against school teachers, right? You won't have that kind of clash, but you probably have difference of opinion which will go to the government, you'll sign petitions, etc., etc. But in what globalization did was that it put a great degree of emphasis on the individual in the marketplace, right? So when the individual marketplace, the other ideologies, public ideologies we know, secularism, left-wing activism, trade unionism, etc., etc., they became less and less important. But we know as social scientists that individuals, we human beings, have one very big flaw, and that flaw is that we always seek group anchor. We always want some group identity. We always want to belong, shall we say. And as the old sense of belonging has been more or less, you know, rooted out, what are we left with? We are left with things like caste, religion, etc., etc., and they seem very attractive. But at the same time, I must tell you this, that none of these things happen on their own. And globalization has often been blamed because there's so much of animosity going around. But it's not simply globalization. There are political processes that are interested in creating fissures, you know, between communities, and only then do such violent incidents happen. What globalization has done so far is placing the individual in the center, and around it the marketplace and the forces of the market, thereby undermining earlier ideologies that created a group identity. Failing which, what do individuals do? They fall back on certain historic notions of who they are, which are usually, we might say, quote unquote, backward in character.
Now, in the context of globalization, and one of the co-constituent of globalization is the ICT, and we are talking about a formation of different kind of a social context in society. Now, the knowledge worker altogether constituting roughly around 39% of our workforce, and now we are finding a formation of different kind of a communities, and as you are talking about that individual is getting privilege over the community. So, do you like to say that the whole kind of a notion as talking by MacDonald and also spoken by Manuel Castells, the fluidity of identity that is getting privileged over the collectivity of identity?
No, these identities have always been fluid. I don't know why people say fluid identities come up now. I've been very puzzled by this because I have read it on several occasions. Identities have all been fluid. What is good today is not good tomorrow. Things like that. The enemy of today is not an enemy of tomorrow. Bal Thackeray, for example, found the South Indians to be his enemies. Prior to Shiv Sena's formation in the Samyukta Mahastra Samiti, the same people thought Gujaratis were the enemies. After 1967, Bal Thackeray believed that the communists were his enemies. Then in 1980s, he decided that Muslims are his enemies. So it keeps changing, and that's happening all the time. At some point, you think caste is most important. Sometimes you think religion is most important. Sometimes language. Border disputes over water, for example. So these things can change, and they do change. So this idea of fluidity, as if it is something very peculiar to contemporary times, I think is a bit overdone. I think it's always been fluid, but the fact is that now that we are moving a lot from place to place, the chances of retaining identities of a certain kind are difficult. Now, this has to be again approached cautiously. When a person moves from a village to a city, at that point, that person is usually rudderless and rootless, looking for community solace, and support. And at that time, the person is very prone to these community kinds of politics and community formations. By the time you are 3 or 4 generations urban, it doesn't matter so much. But the first or second generation urban, quite surprisingly, these issues are very important for them. You will also find among the diaspora, you're talking about globalization. When, for example, when Indians go to North America or England, you'll find the first generation Indian becomes very rigidly Indian. But a third generation, father and grandfather and grandson can't even communicate, because things have moved so much. So these are, again, as I told you earlier, it's a contextual point that needs to be emphasized. And urbanization in the first round often creates a high degree of tension, and people are ready to be plucked, for this purpose. You look at all those who are in the thick of these ethnic uprisings, you'll find that they are all got very shallow urban depth, in terms of generation. And after a period of time, it doesn't matter so much as it used to earlier. So this is the way it is. You find most of the new migrants from Konkan area are the ones who are most involved with anti-migration movements in Bombay. So that's the way it is.
Is there a relationship with the threat perception of a community from the related to this identity construction?
Yes, of course. I mean, that's why the other becomes such a hated other, because it is they're seen as a threat. As I told you earlier, during the Samyukta Mahastra Samiti times, when they were fighting for Maharashtra, at that time the Gujarati was a threat. Then came the South Indians as threat because the middle class and lower middle class Marathi youth in Bombay felt that South Indians were competing against them for white collar jobs. Then the communists became a threat, then the Muslims became a threat. So the whole question is, how do you pose a threat, and how do you pose a credible threat? And a credible threat has to depend upon a context. It doesn't just happen on its own. Today, if, for example, certain communalists or ethnicists rather wanted to create a problem in Gujarat, they'd find it very difficult. Even in Bombay, they'd find it very difficult. But in 2002, it happened so easily. 1984 in Delhi, it happened so easily. Right? So the context and threat, yes, you see the other as coming in your way in a very significant fashion. Either your job is at stake, your culture is at stake, or your nationhood is at stake. And remember, the idea of nationhood is not a very comfortable one, because nationhood talks about the people, the authentic people who are united together because of, as I told you earlier, common sorrows, common joys, common endeavors over a long historical period, where the soil has been fed and nurtured on their blood, that kind of feeling. But a modern nation state is a modern nation state when it is not that kind of nationalism that spurs people to act, as you said, in secular identities, but in terms of citizenship. In citizenship, you don't think of blood, soil, territory. You think of the other as equal to you by law. This is the very difficult thing, very difficult, because I told you earlier, we human beings are very flawed. We like to see the other as if the other is naturally different. So whenever there's a problem between this community and that community, they'll say these people are naturally lazy, or these people are naturally avaricious, or these people are naturally lustful. They don't see it in terms of other social parameters. We tend to see things in natural fashion. So social distinctions are given a natural color, and then all hell breaks loose. And that is where citizenship comes in. And that is where I think the secularism is secularism only when they abide by the norms of citizenship, not charity, not goodwill, not holding hands, going to prayer meetings. But if somebody from another community has been brutalized and his citizenship or her citizenship rights have been transgressed, if you stand up for that legally and constitutionally, that I think is the best way of upholding secular identities. The secular identity is the identity of citizenship.
Now coming this within India, we find the multiplicity of the identities. As we have already described, there are a lot of varieties of them. We are having this son of the soil kind of a contrast. We are having also this ethnic, the caste, other kind of identities. Now we are also having some kind of a problem, pan-Indian kind of a identity. At times it gets constructed over a period of time, and then it gets diluted. Now lot of Indians, when they have gone to Australia, recently the Australian episode, the Indians, different kind of identity construction is going on among the students working in Australia. Now what are those factors bringing them together, but when they are coming to India, they remain divided, maybe in terms of caste, ethnicity, class, etc. kind of a character.
It's a level of differentiation, you see. When the differentiation is in the village, it is between caste and caste. It makes a big difference. Now you go to the level of the legislative assembly, forget the parliamentary situation, parliamentary constituency. The legislative assembly, you will find roughly 15 to 16 castes of roughly the same strength. So their caste politics will not really matter so much. But in the villages, caste politics matters a lot. Because in one village you have, shall we say, the Jats who are preponderant. You cross the street, Gujars are preponderant. It happens like that all through. So caste politics has a certain role to play, religious politics has a certain role to play, depending on the level at which the whole thing has been organized. Now we have often said that there is a caste politics of scheduled caste or OBCs and so forth, which is true. But if you look at it closely, something else emerges. That is, when you say scheduled caste politics, or you will find that there are many areas where Mayawati won in 2007, where there were few scheduled castes. Many areas where Mayawati lost in 2007, there were many scheduled castes. So it's not as if you are a scheduled caste, you're automatically lining up to vote for this or that group. If caste and politics were so simple, then you could predict an election outcome in advance. You're Gujar, you'll vote here. You're Yadav, you'll vote there. But it does not happen that way, because I, as a Gujar, or you as a Gujar or Yadav, we are not natural enemies, natural friends in terms of caste. So when we come together for political purposes, there must be another reason. Because on the basis of caste alone, nobody can win an election. In the Jat stronghold of UP, the Jats, in the best of circumstances, constitute only 8% of the population. In the best of situations, in Madhepura in Bihar, the Yadavs constitute 21% of the population. So if every Yadav votes for Yadav, he will still not win. So when people go to vote, they don't all, and what is more, there are 15 castes in a particular area, and there are only 3 viable candidates. You You can't have 15 viable candidates. 3, then I have to perforce vote outside my caste. So it is all a question of context. So when castes, what seems like caste politics is actually something more. People of different castes have come together because they have a common life situation. They all want to get to urban India, or they all want rural prices to be raised, or they all want fertilizer prices to be dropped. They have something in common that brings them together.
So, do you like to say there is a secular basis of organizing primordiality?
There is a lot of that, especially that's why I'm saying when it comes to caste and language, we must look at the secular reasons for what seems to be a cultural phenomenon. When it comes to ethnicity, what happens is there's no economic basis for it. It is a question of how politicians are able to whip up certain passions in certain points of time when the idea of a nation state being threatened, becomes quite palpable. At least people begin to think it's credible. So everything has its place. Communalism at certain times, language, yes, economics are behind it, economic factors, caste, economic factors, but ethnicity of the Hindu, Muslim, or whatever kind, where the nation state is seen to be in peril, it is not economics at all. You talked about Indians in Australia, sure, it will happen. Why Indians in Australia? You take Bengalis and put them in Delhi, they'll all come together under some Tagore banner or the other. You put them back somewhere else, they'll find other flaws and other differences, other faults. This always happens. The context is important. Which context, what kind of bonds are going to cement, and what kinds are going to fall by the wayside.
Thank you, Professor Gupta, for giving a very, very lucid kind of a description and on the whole issues, that is how it is being constructed, it is being manipulated, used by the politicians, and also within them there is a process of secularization of this identity, and that is growing over a period of time. Thank you very much for coming over to the studio and enlightening us on
Well,
this
I hope
topic.
so.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.